worked so hard on for so long. So Jim, take it away.
Brace yourself, here we go. This is a discussion, a talk about Anne and my most recent book, which is this one, in case you need a picture of it. It's The Davidson Family of Rural Hill, North Carolina, 3 Generations of on a Piedmont Plantation by Jim and Ann Williams, published by McFarland up in Lexington, North Carolina. Who's that?
Please silence your phone.
Okay, somebody's phone. I'd like to start this with a paragraph from the introduction, which is also on the back cover of the book, because I think it sets the stage. John Davidson came to North Carolina backcountry circa 1751 as a young man with his sister and widowed mother. Typical of Scots-Irish settlers, they arrived with little more than basic farming tools, determined to make it on their own terms. Davidson worked hard, prospered, married well, and built a plantation on the Catawba River he called Rural Hill. The Davidsons were loyal British citizens until the Crown's overbearing authority spurred Davidson and his neighbors to become soldiers in the Revolutionary War. After the war, Davidson managed his plantation, created shad fisheries, helped develop the local iron industry with his sons-in-law, and was an early planter of cotton. His sons and grandsons relied on slave labor, continuously increased the improved the acreage, and became early practitioners of scientific farming. Drawing on public documents, family papers, and slave records, this history describes how a fiercely independent family grew their lands and fortunes into a lasting legacy. So with that introduction, I will step into the first topic, which is how we managed to write this thing. And I'm glad to see that Ed McLean's here because he's going to hear about himself. Ann and I had volunteered at all the historic sites, doing interpretations, presentations, scenarios, and that included Rural Hill back in 2012. We had done a presentation up there on an early Scotch wedding, which was lots of fun, and several others. We got to know Ed McLean, who was the site director at the time, and he said that we had a problem with that site. They didn't have a comprehensive history of the family or of the site, and he thought that Ann and I should write that. And we said, oh, okay, that's a good idea. We'll do that sometime. And then after mentioning it several times, he mentioned that he thought he could get an arts and science grant for $10,000 to fund the effort. And that changed the topic totally. Hold on, let me get, that's what I need. Okay. Oh, I don't know what I'm seeing here. Okay, well, let me change that back again. Okay, that changed it significantly, and we said, oh, okay, we'll go ahead and get the grant. And then nothing happened for, I don't know, a couple of weeks. And we asked, and he said, oh, I'm working on it. And then, I don't know why, but I got in conversation with him and told him that we did a lot of presentations and got honorariums from various places that were always turned over immediately to a history site that could use the money, and that if we got this grant, it would immediately come back to Rural Hill. And we had the grant in 1 or 2 days, and started in on developing the story. We had a 6-month schedule for this, and We wrote it as a series of papers, a series of monographs on various subjects about the history of the site and of the Davidson family. We punched it and put it in 3-ring binders and published it, initially 20 copies for the staff, the local libraries, and other interested organizations, and then got more requests and eventually published about 50 copies of it. And that was the end of that. It was up on the Rural Hill website, and we were done with our job. About 3 years later, Anne had written 2 books before this time, and she wrote 2 more, one of them being on the Brevard Davidson farm journals. We were looking for what the next project should be, and thought about this this loose leaf binder, and went back and revisited it and realized that we had learned a great deal about the Rural Hill and the Davidson family over the intervening years, and that this would make a good book. It would have to be rewritten as a narrative rather than a group of monographs. And so we proceeded with that. Well, that was a 2-year project to add the new information and rewrite everything so that it flowed as a single book. And then we had it ready for publication. We thought we would put it on Amazon because we'd done 2 other books on Amazon, which is very easy to do. Then somehow we thought, well, maybe a legitimate publisher would be interested in this. I had in mind the History Press, but somehow I sent it off first to McFarland. If you don't know, McFarland is up in Jefferson, North Carolina. They publish about 140 books a year, all nonfiction, good bit of it history, or some of it very modern history. And they had published Scott Seifert's book on the MacDeck, and another one of his on outstanding characters in the county. So I sent it off to them and immediately got a response back saying, we're very interested. I thought they just wouldn't be interested in this, but they're very interested. We put a condition on it that we had to be able to buy the copies wholesale, because McFarland tends to price their books at $35 to $50. And we wanted to write this book for our friends who didn't want to spend that much money. And they came back and said, that'll be fine. And in the end, it wound up being a cost of about $25 a book. And that's what I'm selling it for now. And I'll tell you at the end of this how you can get your own copy. The bad news is we discovered once we had signed the contract, it was going to be 9 months before we could see the book. And it started with their requirement to add a lot of introductory information and to add a chapter on Rural Hill and the Davidsons after the Civil War up to the current time, or up to pretty recent time when May Davidson died. Then we waited a couple of months and they assigned a copy editor, and he completely tore it to pieces and put it back together again. It's a much better book now than it was before. And finally, the copy editor was finished, and well, now when's it going to be published? Well, we have it on the schedule for the winter. And we received the first copies on January 31st, just in time for the COVID lockdown and to cancel all the presentations that we had planned, including this one. Anne died on February 20th. And so we've been kind of sitting on these books since then. And you have the honor of being the first group that's heard this presentation. I'd like to mention something about the books that we have used to get here. There are a number of books published about Mecklenburg County and about this this area, the Rural Hill area. The first one was Reverend Foote in 1844, Presbyterian minister. So it was almost 100 years after the first part of this book. And then there was one by John Hill Wheeler and one Dr. C.L. Hutter in 51 and 1777. The most important of these books was by J.B. Alexander in 1898 with stories of Mecklenburg and of that corner of the county. But he said what other people had said, that these are just stories. He doesn't know the truth of them. They tend to be, you talk to someone and they say, well, my grandfather told me that his grandfather told him that this is the way it was. So we understood after reviewing all this, we were going to have to verify every word that was in any of them, and spent a lot of time in the Davidson family collection at UNCC, in special collections there. In fact, when she first got involved in this, she asked to see all the papers. It took 2 large carts to bring all the papers up to us. So there's a tremendous amount of information, of letters and receipts, and most importantly, of Brevard Davidson's farm journal that I'll talk about later on. In addition to that, we had access to grants, deeds, wills, and estate records from the very beginning of this period, and court records from 1774 up. So we were able to use those to verify these stories and to discover entirely new stories that had not been told. The book structure, as you will read it, is there's an introduction, and then we talk about the 2 early families, Isabella Davidson and her son John, and Samuel Wilson and his daughter Violet. It goes through the family with one digression. We put in a fairly large section on Robin and Peggy Davidson of Holly Bend because they add a great deal to that story. And then it goes to John Davidson Jr., Jackie, and then Adam Brevard Davidson. And then there's a final section, almost final section on farming in this area, because with Brevard's journals, we had learned a great deal about farming in this area, and it is fascinating. And then finally, we wrote a chapter on the last 3 generations and up to the present, up to May Davidson, actually, finally. And then we have 17 appendices. These are subjects that didn't quite fit in the rest of the book, but were important in case somebody wanted to read them. Some of them fairly esoteric, some of them just really good stories, and they tend to be 1 or 2 pages, and I've extracted from a number of them to publish in the weekly note, because I don't mind stealing, especially from myself. The research we did on the early families is very interesting, because there's so much that was unknown and untold until we went and looked at the family records and at the legal records. what we saw in the books was that John Davidson, a blacksmith, and married Violet Wilson, the daughter of Samuel Wilson, and her father gave her a wedding gift of land on McDowell Creek, which is where Rural Hill was built. And that's all wrong. There's no truth in that at all. We researched Major John's mother, Isabella Ramsey Davidson, and learned very little about her, and a good bit of it was wrong. We were able to figure out probably when she was born and perhaps when they married and maybe when his father died. The only thing we really knew from research in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, is that John Davidson, his widowed mother, and his younger sister Mary came down to this area about 1751 when development first opened here. We knew that his mother Isabella had been a widow for some years, perhaps 10 years. We presume that when her husband died, she, as usual, went and lived with relatives. It might have been the Ramseys, probably it was the Davidsons. And then when it came time to move down to the Carolinas, these families all moved in large family groups. There's little evidence of that, but certainly they showed up here about the same time. And the Davidsons were one of those groups. The Brevards and the other ones. Anyway, and we think that Major John and his mother went to live with George Davidson. George Davidson was probably Isabella's brother-in-law, and they lived on Davidson Creek. And so probably this is where they went. And then we discovered something that we'd never seen before, which is that shortly after coming down here, Isabella remarried to a fellow named Henry Hendry. That's Hendry with a D. And he was a prominent person here in a number of public offices. He had emigrated here about the same time that they did, and probably was a widower with one or two small children. But that's where they got married and settled over near where UNCC is today anyway. Major John Davidson was 16 years old when they came down here. He was trained as a blacksmith, although he wouldn't be able to enter into contracts until he turned 21 when he got his majority. But he did practice his craft, and he may have contributed to the family income, but I think he mainly saved his money, because when he was 22, he bought a piece of land on Cottle Creek, which is where UNCC is, more or less. And he bought this land that had at one time been owned by Henry Hendry, but wasn't at that time. He farmed that land for 2 years. He married Violet Wilson. They had 2 children. And 3 years after they were married, he purchased a piece of land on McDowell Creek from his father-in-law. So instead of a wedding present, this was a purchase at a sizable price, at a reasonable price of of 250 acres for 45 pounds on McDowell Creek. He found a cabin or built one, and they moved in and set up housekeeping. Over the years, he added 7 more rooms to that cabin. He finally had an 8-room cabin because they had 10 children. And then in 1778, he built the magnificent manor house of Rural Hill. 1778 is an interesting number. That was the middle of the Revolution. And he was building a big house. Well, it took, in those days, 2 or 3 years to build a house. You had to start by digging up the clay and mixing it with sand and mixing it together and forming the bricks and firing the bricks, not to mention going off to Philadelphia to get window glass and other things. So it was a few years, and in 1778, nothing was going on here with the war. That was all up north. And we had our troubles with the Indians and with the Tories, but there was not a war going on here. And so we built this land, and I would like to read a section from the book about Violet's father, Samuel Wilson, which illustrates some of the things you run into in the old books. According to several early histories, Samuel Wilson came from England, Ireland, or Pennsylvania, and came down to Mecklenburg via Charleston, South Carolina, or down the wagon road from Pennsylvania. It is said that he was related to the famous English portrait artist and painter, Benjamin Wilson. And there's also an account that Sir Robert Wilson, the English general, Sir Robert Thomas Wilson, was a relative of his and visited the Wilson family, quote, in after years, quote. No documentary evidence has been found confirming any of these stories. And this is what you get when you read the old books. We have tracked that down and have figured out a good bit of how it happened. We still don't know where he came from or how he got here. John married Violet, who was the daughter of Samuel Wilson, and he had 3 wives. She was the daughter of the first wife, and these 3 wives were in sequence. And the third wife is quite interesting because he married Margaret Jack. He was 55 and she was 18. And the first baby was born within 9 months of the marriage. She had 5 children, and so a total of 10 children with 3 wives. She was the sister of Captain James Jack, who carried the Mecklenburg Declaration to Pennsylvania. And so we have a section in there about that aspect of it, because James Jack is not the nice guy you think he is. They think that he was. And I'll leave that to you to read up on. Major John built a plantation of probably 2,000 acres. We really don't know because there was some deeds weren't registered and there was various buying and selling, but probably 2,000 acres. He was a farmer. When the revolution came along, he served in the militia and was a major. And we have called him Major John whenever we could, in order to distinguish him from all of the other John Davidsons in the area at that time. His son, John. There was a John Davidson who was a prominent merchant in Charlotte. and several other John Davidsons we identified. In fact, we identified 4 or 5 families, Davidson families in the county that, as far as we know, are not related to each other this side of the ocean. There just aren't records that do that. There were no, at that time, there were no birth certificates. Marriage certificates were by the minister. There was no death certificates. Some wills, if somebody had enough money to leave, he wrote a will, and the estate papers that went with that. So there's a lot of things we just don't know. John Davidson, after the Revolutionary War, well, in 1790, joined in with 2 of his sons-in-law to open a forge or a blast furnace and make iron in Lincoln County. This had been going on for some time at that time, but theirs was probably the largest. They had 6,000 acres in their iron works, most of that growing wood to make charcoal to run the blast furnace. Those sons were Joseph Graham and Alexander, General Joseph Graham and Alexander Brevard. John exited that business fairly quickly and made a fortune. It was a very good business to be in. Graham and Brevard continued on with the business, and then Brevard bought out Graham and continued on. The family continued on up to the Civil War. It was a very good business, making cast iron pots and pans and such. The buildings of that iron making were the Vesuvius Furnace and Mount Tirzah Forge, both of which houses still exist today over in Lincoln County. And you can take a tour of those and see what that's all about. In addition to that, Major John partnered with his son Robin and did some fishing. We know that because there were some deeds that were for a small amount of land at a very high price, and they said, "and the fishery." This is shad fishing. He's a member of the herring family. And in that time, well, up until the building of flood control dams, all streams in northern North America, from Nova Scotia down to Florida, all streams had annual migrations of shad going upstream to spawn. And when they were done with that, the fish went back down to the ocean. The descriptions we have of what that looked like is that the river turned bright silver from being filled with shad, and it looked as if you could walk across the river on their backs. Well, all along the Catawba, especially in the Great Bend, and the Davidson family and the Latta family, they built dams in the river, not all the way across, but partway across the river. And when the fish were swimming upstream, they caught them in nets, cleaned them, salted them, and put them in barrels. And that fed the family for the year. And they sold them to neighbors and sold them to merchants in Charlotte. And we have pretty good evidence that they sold a huge quantity of them, of these barreled fish, down to Charleston and for the export market and out into the sugar islands in the Caribbean. And Major John was an early adapter of cotton, which made him another fortune. Because if you could afford the labor, those early days, it was immensely profitable. Rural Hill doesn't exist today because it burned, and this is what it looks like. looked like. It burned in 1886, and this photo was from 1890. We have pretty good evidence that the woman is Minnie Caldwell Davidson, the wife of John Springs Davidson. And in the background, you see John Springs and two of their sons, Joe Graham and Thomas, we think. It's an interesting picture. You see two dogs and a sheep. Well, in those days before the invention of the lawnmower, many people kept sheep on their property. They kept the grass down and manageable. They fertilized the grass, and then, of course, in the fall, you could fleece them and use the fleece to spin or to sell. The other thing to notice here is on the left there is a large tree. This is an English boxwood, which probably dated up, probably was 100 years old then, and it's still out there. Those boxwoods 130 years later after this picture are still out there. Beautiful thing. They just continue to grow. Across the road from Rural Hill was the Davidson family burying ground, and it is there today and contains a large number of the Davidson family, and it's a pleasure to walk out in that quiet place and read the epigraphs that on the tombstones. The next subject in the book is about Robin Davidson. Interesting fellow. He grew up on Rural Hill, of course. When he reached his majority, he saved some money and bought a piece of land, got a grant for a small piece of land that was nestled in with other pieces and nobody had noticed that hadn't been granted. So he applied for that and got granted. It adjoined his father's land and McDowell Creek. And we don't know exactly why, but right after that, Major John purchased half of that land from Robin and then gave him a huge piece of land adjacent to his out in the Great Bend of the Catawba, which is where Cedar Grove is today. And this is someplace here, yeah. This is what Cedar Grove looks like today. By the way, all of these pictures are in the book.
Is that not Holly Bend?
I'm sorry?
Is that not Holly Bend?
Yeah, it is.
What did I say? I'm sorry. This is Holly Bend. This is where yeah. Got confused. Thank you. Robin farmed and did well, and then in January 1st, 1801, married Peggy Osborne, Margaret Osborne, known as Peggy. And they lived there the rest of their lives. Robin and Peggy did not have any children, and the family story is that Peggy had no toes. We've never figured out where that came from, but it certainly gets told a lot of different times. Holly Bend, by the way, is a very modern name from the middle 20th century. We don't know that whether they named that land or not. There's a lot of interesting stories about Holly Bend. One that we particularly appreciate is that we discovered an autobiography of a fella named Edwin Osborne, written very late in his life, of course, that is tied into Holly Bend. In the 1830s, 40s, 50s, there was a great diaspora, a great movement of people from North Carolina, and especially from Mecklenburg County out to the west for cheap, fertile land, to Tennessee to begin with, which was, of course, part of North Carolina at first, and then to Alabama and Mississippi and Texas, and even on to California, where there's a lot of descendants out there now. Edwin Osborne was in one of those families. He was born in Alabama and raised in Texas. And when he reached the age of 21, he decided he wanted an education, and he knew about Aunt Peggy Davidson, Peggy Osborne Davidson, and he wrote to her and asked her if she would give him an education. And she wrote back immediately that certainly, if you can get yourself to Mecklenburg, I will give you an education. This was 1858. So Robin was dead by that time. Peggy was a widow living in Holly Bend. And Edwin started on his way. He didn't have much money that we know of. He apparently had enough money to get on a boat and go down to Memphis. And once he got to Memphis, he walked 800 miles to Mecklenburg, which is amazing. But that's what he did because he needed education. He got to Mecklenburg. There's a wonderful passage from his autobiography about how he reached the Catawba and crossed it and met his Aunt Peggy, who was very short and very round at that time, but a lovely person. And just a brief sketch of Edwin Osborne. He met his relatives for a couple of months because it took that long to meet all his relatives in Mecklenburg County. Peggy put him in a school up in Statesville. The Civil War broke out. He served with honor, was wounded 3 times, and recovered from his wounds at Holly Bend each time. After the war, he studied law, became the county court clerk, and made a bunch of money on that. But he married an Episcopalian, and she converted him from Presbyterianism, and he became an Episcopalian priest and did missionary work up in the Blue Ridge, and then came back to Charlotte and did missionary work out in the outskirts of Charlotte. And then in 1886, he got the idea that this area needed an orphanage. Orphanages had been allowed in the Constitution, but no money was appointed for them. 4 religious orphanages had been formed, and he wanted to have an Episcopalian orphanage here. He found a piece of land that had been donated to the church by a guy named Thompson, and he got that land and opened an orphanage. This is the land along Sugar Creek Greenway today. And in that greenway, there is the chapel of St. Mary, which was the chapel of the orphanage. He ran that orphanage until the Spanish-American War, when he went off to be a chaplain. And that organization still exists today, the Thompson organization. And then I return to the main thread here. The second generation at Rural Hill was John Davidson, Jackie Davidson, who farmed with his father to begin with, and then later on with his son, Brevard. He and his wife had 10 children. So Major John had 10 children, and they had 10 children. And then the next generation is Adam Brevard Davidson. Now we know a lot about him because he kept a farm journal to describe how his farm was going so he would know how to improve it. This was scientific farming, and it was very popular at the time. He served on the board and got some prizes and so on. But he kept these journals, which included things about the farm, but also other information. So we really have fleshed out that particular character. He married quite well. He married Mary Laura Springs. Of the Springs family, you probably recognize Springs Mills. This was that family. They were extremely rich, huge land holdings in South Carolina, right up next to the North Carolina border. Two of the most important people in Charlotte were the Springs family. The family had been here since the beginning of the development, but when they first got here, the name was Springsteen, as yes, Bruce Springsteen is related to that family. They came from, they're Dutch and came from New Netherlands, from New York. And Bruce has talked to the Springs family here. As a wedding gift, Mary received from her father 1,000 acres in Lincoln County and an appropriate number of slaves. Of course, this became Brevard's property the moment she said, "I do," because that's the way it was in those days. Brevard gave a great deal of assistance, served on the board for the building of Davidson College, and we have a section on that. And he was one of the founders of the Charlotte and South Carolina Railroad, which came in 52 and made such a tremendous difference in the development of this area and of Charlotte in particular. Brevard was too old to go to the Civil War. His sons went. After the war, it was all chaos. And people going bankrupt and land changing hands and so on. It was terrible. And he decided that being a farmer was not a good way to make a living at this point. He kept the land and rented it out, but he moved to Charlotte. He retired to Charlotte and went into the real estate business and made a second fortune buying and selling buildings in Charlotte. By that time, after the Civil War, Charlotte was beginning to develop a good deal, and he made a bunch of money on that. This is, let me find this. Where are you? There it is. This is Adam Brevard Davidson in his later years when he moved to Charlotte. The distinguished man. There's a lot of pictures of him in the archives. And you may notice he's holding something he seems to be showing off that he's proud of. It's a key. And we tried to find out what that was about. It's not a Phi Beta Kappa key. It's not a Davidson College key, but something that he was very proud of. Brevard had all these children, but apparently he didn't trust them. In his will, he left his entire fortune to E.L. Baxter Davidson. That's this gentleman here. And he gave his children lots of property, but it was all tied to Baxter. He gave one of his sons a commercial building in Charlotte with the condition that Baxter would run it and pay the boy or the man the annual profit on it. Baxter was very involved in the Davidson family and in Mecklenburg County. He had a considerable amount of money, and he spent a good bit of it on stone walls and bronze plaques. This is up on Neck Road. This is a plaque to Major John Davidson, and Baxter, of course, is here. And you notice the wall behind is a very distinctive architecture with dark stones and light stones on the top. This is the same design as in the Rural Hill Burying Ground. It's the same design as the wall that's in front of Hopewell Church on Beatty's Ford Road. And there are several other walls that we've seen. We aren't able to determine that they specifically came from him, but they certainly have that same characteristic architecture. And we also have found something we think belongs to him. There are a number of cast iron mile markers that you stumble across every now and then, one on East Boulevard. And we think that Brevard made these and put them on all of the major roads coming out of Charlotte. So we would know that you went from you're 2 miles from Charlotte, or 3 miles, or 4 miles. And this was done fairly often back in those days before the invention of the motor car. When you needed, and there weren't maps and there weren't signposts, you needed to know where you were. Out in the countryside, they often were stones that on one side said, 3 miles to Charlotte, and the other side said 4 miles to Pineville, sort of a thing. This brings us to almost to the end. The next chapter in the book is a section on farming. I've described that to you. It is illuminating in helping you understand what happened before the internal combustion engine, before there were tractors, when everyone was a farmer pretty much, and you worked from dawn to dusk 6 days a week and spent your time behind a plow looking at the back end of a horse. And but this is the way it was. And the chapter talks some about this, about the fact you have to plow the ground 3 times before you can plant the crop, and so on. So that's interesting. Now the last chapter is good. The last chapter is on the last 3 generations, and it contains some information that McFarland suggested we have to have in there, concentrating on the last 4 people who lived at Rural Hill. The oldest one was Joe Graham, who was a pilot in the Second World War and died in a plane crash, and his remains are buried at the Rural Hill Burying Ground. The second son was John Springs Davidson, who also served in the Second World War and fought at the Battle of the Bulge, and then came home to Rural Hill and was a gentleman farmer from then on. The 2 girls were Elizabeth and May. And May was a secretary in downtown Charlotte before the war. And when the Second World War broke out, she moved to Washington, D.C., as so many young girls did, to fill the ranks there, and was a secretary there and liked it so much that she stayed there after the war and worked as a secretary until she retired. And at the end of her life, I keep losing these things. There we go. She worked for Senator Sam Ervin of Watergate fame. And he said lots of nice things to say about her. He came from Morganton. And then she retired and moved back to Rural Hill and died just a few years ago, leaving sizable bequests to the site, and building a large building for special events and so on. I should mention, I forgot to mention, E.L. Baxter Davidson, at the end of his life, we married very late in life, and then at the end of his life, he gave a bequest to Davidson College of $1 million, which was the largest bequest they had ever had. That is the end of the story, except to mention that there are 17 appendices, most of which you don't want to read because there are details about deeds and so on. But there's some interesting stories there, some of which you have seen in the weekly letter email. Plum, about 1800, was a slave, and then a freedman, and then a property owner. And the court records that show that are very illuminating. The Reverend Alexander, and these really are stories that we have figured out from the historical record. The Reverend Alexander Caldwell was declared by the Mecklenburg court to be a lunatic, back to Rural Hill, and spent most of their life after that at Rural Hill. There's a section on Davidson College and the connection that Major John had with the founding of that college. There's a separate section on iron making. A good bit of that is mentioned in the book in other chapters, but here is a description of exactly how they made iron in those days, in those early days. And finally, there's this little section in there on the value of money. As we did presentations in various places, the question was almost always asked, how much is that worth? What's that in modern funds? A grant cost 2 shillings per 100 acres. What does that mean in modern money? And there is no way to tell, except that we've figured out some things. One is that at the time of the American Revolution, the wage for a working man plowing a field was $1 a day. In the First World War, there was a popular song called, I think, You're in the Army Now, You're Not Behind a Plow. And there's a line in there that goes, $1 a day is plenty of pay, but I got mad and I quit. $1 a day, just as it was in the First World War, just as it was in the Revolution, because the money was based on gold and silver, on bullion, and it couldn't change value because the value of gold was the value of gold. After the First World War in the 1920s, especially in the 1930s, we went off the gold standard and began to inflate the currency. And so now there is hardly any way to relate what money is worth today to what it was 100, 200, 300 years ago. One example that I like to use, my father graduated with a PhD from Columbia University and went to work in a small Midwestern college for a salary of $1,200 a year, and thought himself very fortunate to make that large amount of money. So that was 1940. So it gives you some idea of how much we've inflated since then. That is the end. And I'll take any questions. Oh, wait a minute. One more thing. Which is that, as I mentioned, I have a number of books, a number of copies of the book, because I've not had a chance to meet with people and sign books. If you want to come by, I'll sell you a book for $25 and sign it any way you want. If you'd rather send me a letter, well, send me an email and talk about it. Send me a check for $25 plus $5 shipping and handling, and tell me what to write in the book, because I will endorse it any way you like, even as far as saying signing it for Jim and Ann Williams. So if you want a copy of the book, if it looks like this, let me know. Valerie, I think I'm done.
All right. Very good. Well, thank you. I apologize for that glitch. I don't know what happened to my internet connection there for a second, but I think it's okay. Let me stop this recording here.